The sun was beginning to set behind the low hills surrounding the small village of Gleaner. Shadows stretched long over the cobbled streets, and a quiet calm began to descend upon the town. The air was rich with the earthy scent of freshly tilled soil, as farmers returned from the fields, their carts laden with the final harvests of the season. Among them, Edwin, a humble apprentice at the village forge, was finishing his day's work, hammering a glowing piece of iron into shape. Sparks flew from his anvil with each strike, but his thoughts were far away. Edwin was tall for his age, with broad shoulders from years of hard labor. His hands, though young, bore the marks of a life spent shaping metal. He worked diligently, but something within him stirred uneasily. There was a restlessness that had been growing in his heart, a longing for something more than the life he had known. He didn't understand it. He had always been grateful to Master Heir, the blacksmith who had taken him in as a child. Yet, the same dream had haunted him for nights on end. A castle, bathed in twilight, crumbling under the weight of unseen hands, and a voice calling his name, urging him to wake. "Edwin, lad, you're drifting again?" The voice of Master Heir snapped him from his reverie. Heir, a gruff but kind-hearted man, stood by the door, wiping his hands on a leather apron. He had been more than just a master to Edwin. He was the closest thing the boy had to a father. No one in the village knew where Edwin had come from. He had been found one evening, as a babe, abandoned at the edge of the forest, wrapped in a woolen blanket with no name, no family. The village folk had been suspicious at first, but Heir had taken him in, raising him as his own. For years, Edwin had lived quietly, learning the craft of the forge and becoming part of the small, close-knit community. "I'm sorry, master," Edwin replied, forcing a smile. He placed the half-finished blade onto the workbench and wiped the sweat from his brow. "I'll finish it tomorrow." Heir studied him for a moment, his sharp eyes narrowing. "It's not the blade that's troubling you, is it?" Edwin hesitated, unsure of how to explain the restlessness gnawing at him. He shook his head. "Just tired, I suppose?" The older man nodded, though it was clear he wasn't convinced. "Get some rest, lad. There's a big order to finish by the week's end, and I need you sharp." Edwin nodded and headed out of the forge, his body aching from the day's labor. The village square was quiet now, with only a few merchants closing up their stalls. The light of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, but Edwin barely noticed. His mind was still tangled in the dreams that wouldn't leave him. He walked the familiar path through the village, passing the well where the townsfolk gathered water and gossip. The stone houses stood in neat rows, their thatched roofs glowing softly in the fading light. As he approached his small cottage, nestled at the edge of the village, Edwin paused. Something felt wrong. The quiet of the evening was too thick, too still. His eyes darted across the tree line, where the forest loomed dark and ancient. He had never feared the woods before, but tonight there was a weight in the air, a tension that prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. Shaking off the feeling, Edwin stepped inside his home. It was modest, a single room with a hearth, a small bed, and a few belongings. On the table, an old, weathered book sat open, its pages yellowed with age. It was one of the few possessions Edwin had that might hint at his past. The blacksmith had found it with him as a baby, but neither could make sense of the strange symbols and faded ink that filled its pages. Edwin had spent countless hours staring at it, wondering if it held the key to who he really was. But tonight, the book was the last thing on his mind. He moved to the hearth, where a fire was already burning low. The evening chill had set in, and he welcomed the warmth as he sat down on the rough-hewn stool. Just as he began to relax, a knock echoed through the small cottage. He froze. It was late for visitors, especially out here on the edge of the village. His heart quickened as the knock came again, more urgent this time. Rising slowly, he reached for the small dagger that hung by the door, an old habit, though he had never needed to use it. When Edwin opened the door, he was met by the sight of a man cloaked in shadows. his face obscured by the hood of his traveling cloak. The figure stood tall and imposing, and though the night obscured his features, there was a glint of steel at his side, suggesting he was armed. "Edwin," the man asked, his voice deep and gravelly, filled with an authority that sent a shiver down the young man's spine. "Who are you?" Edwin's voice was steady, though his hand tightened around the dagger's hilt. The stranger stepped forward, lowering his hood. His face was rugged, with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. His eyes were sharp, piercing, but not unkind. He looked as though he had traveled far, his cloak worn and caked with dust. "My name is Aldrich," the man said. "I've been looking for you for a long time." Edwin frowned, his grip tightening on the dagger. "What do you want with me?" Aldrich's gaze flickered toward the hearth, then back to Edwin. "You don't know, do you?" "No, what?" "You're not just a blacksmith's apprentice, Edwin. You're the son of the true king." For a moment, the words hung in the air, absurd and impossible. Edwin stared at Aldrich, his mind reeling. He wanted to laugh, to deny it, but something in the man's eyes stopped him. A deep, terrible truth seemed to lurk there. "That's a lie," Edwin whispered, though his voice wavered with doubt. Aldrich shook his head, stepping closer. "I wish it were, but the truth is far darker than you can imagine. You were hidden away, a secret to protect you from those who would see you dead. But the time for hiding is over. The kingdom needs you now." Edwin's heart pounded in his chest. "I don't believe you." "You don't have to," Aldrich replied calmly. "But they do." He pointed toward the tree line, where figures, shadowed and silent, emerged from the forest. Edwin's breath caught in his throat as he realized they were armed, and they were coming for him. Edwin's heart raced as the figures emerged from the shadows, their armor glinting faintly in the dim light of the evening. There were 5 of them, mercenaries by the look of their mismatched gear and the way they moved with deadly precision. Swords drawn, they closed in, their faces hidden beneath darkened helms. For a moment, Edwin stood frozen, his mind struggling to grasp the reality of the situation. "Get inside," Aldrich ordered, his voice sharp as steel. He drew his sword with a swift, practiced motion, the blade gleaming ominously in the firelight. "Now!" Edwin stumbled back into the small cottage, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. His hand gripped the dagger at his side, but it felt pitiful compared to the weapons of the men who were now just steps away. Before he could even think of what to do next, Aldrich slammed the door shut behind him and turned to face the intruders. "Go through the back, and don't stop running until you reach the river," Aldrich commanded, his voice low but urgent. "There's no time to explain. If they catch you, they'll kill you." "But why?" Edwin started, but Aldrich cut him off. "No questions. Just run. Now." A sense of helplessness washed over Edwin. This man, this stranger, had just shattered everything he thought he knew about his life. And now he was supposed to trust him, to run without knowing why, without understanding what was happening? His mind screamed in protest, but something deeper, a primal instinct, urged him to listen, to survive. With one last glance at the door, where the sound of heavy footsteps and the scrape of metal against wood echoed ominously, Edwin bolted toward the back of the cottage. His feet pounded against the stone floor as he made for the rear exit. Behind him, he heard Aldrich's sword clash with one of the attackers, the sharp ring of metal on metal filling the air. The door rattled under the force of blows as the mercenaries attempted to break in. Edwin didn't wait to see what happened next. He threw open the back door and dashed out into the night, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The cool evening air hit his face, but he barely noticed. The only sound in his ears was the pounding of his own heart and the crunch of leaves beneath his boots as he sprinted toward the tree line. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, its twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching out to snatch him. Edwin plunged into the woods without hesitation, his legs burning as he pushed himself faster than he ever had before. Behind him, the distant shouts of the mercenaries grew louder, closer. They were following. Twigs snapped underfoot, and the thick underbrush tore at his clothes as he ran. The trees closed in around him, and the path ahead was nothing but a blur of shadows and tangled roots. Edwin's mind raced along with his feet. The words of the stranger echoed in his head. The son of the true king. It was madness, surely. He couldn't be anyone of importance. He was just a boy, an apprentice, and nobody. Yet, why were these men chasing him? Why were they trying to kill him if it wasn't true? The ground beneath him shifted suddenly, the forest floor sloping downward in a steep incline. Edwin lost his footing, tumbling headlong down a small ravine, the world spinning as branches whipped at his face and arms. He hit the bottom hard, his breath knocked from his lungs as he lay there for a moment, stunned and gasping. His dagger had slipped from his hand during the fall, but he had no time to search for it. He could hear the footsteps closing in, crashing through the forest, deliberate and deadly. The mercenaries weren't far behind. A surge of panic jolted him back to his feet. His body screamed in protest, but he forced himself to move, to keep running. Ahead, through the thick trees, he saw the faint glimmer of water, the river that Aldrich had mentioned. Edwin pushed through the pain, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead. But the river was close now, and beyond it, perhaps safety. As he broke through the last line of trees, he saw it, wide and fast-moving, the water reflecting the silver light of the rising moon. There was no bridge in sight, no easy way across. The sounds of pursuit were deafening now. Edwin could hear the voices of the mercenaries behind him, shouting to each other as they tracked his movements through the forest. He could almost feel the cold steel of their blades at his back. Desperation gripped him. There was no time to think. Without hesitating, Edwin plunged into the icy water. The cold was like a shock to his system, his breath stolen by the sudden chill as the current grabbed hold of him, pulling him downstream. He struggled against it, trying to keep his head above water as the river carried him away. The mercenaries reached the riverbank just as he disappeared into the dark waters, their curses echoing over the roar of the river. Edwin gasped for air, his arms thrashing as he fought to stay afloat. The current was strong, and it dragged him along, faster and faster, until the shouts of the mercenaries faded into the distance. His limbs were numb from the cold, and his strength was fading with every second. But he kept fighting, kept swimming, even as his vision blurred and the edges of his consciousness began to darken. At last, the river spit him out onto a muddy bank, his body limp and shaking from the cold. Edwin crawled onto the shore, his chest heaving as he gulped down air. His entire body trembled with exhaustion, and the world around him spun as he collapsed onto the wet ground, his face pressed against the cold earth. He didn't know how long he lay there, half conscious, before he heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, but not the heavy boots of the mercenaries. His mind, foggy and numb from the cold, barely registered the figure standing over him. "Well," a soft, feminine voice said, laced with amusement. "What have we here?" Edwin forced his eyes open, blinking against the harsh light of the moon as it bathed the stranger in a pale glow. A woman stood before him, her cloak flowing like liquid silver in the wind. Her face was hidden beneath the hood, but there was no mistaking the authority in her voice. She knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his forehead. "You're lucky to be alive," she murmured, her touch warm against his frozen skin. "But you've still got a long way to go, young prince." Edwin's body trembled uncontrollably as he lay on the cold, muddy ground by the riverbank. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his skin, and his limbs felt heavy, almost lifeless. The woman knelt beside him, her cloak billowing softly in the night breeze. Her hand, warm and steady, rested on his forehead, and the simple touch seemed to ignite a faint spark of life in him. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw, his lips cracked from the cold river water. He could barely move, let alone form words. The woman tilted her head, as if examining him more closely. Her hood obscured most of her face, but Edwin could see the faintest glint of silver hair beneath it, catching the moonlight. There was something about her presence, calm yet powerful, that made him feel safe, despite the chaos of the night. "You mustn't try to speak yet," she said, her voice a quiet command. "You've been through more than most could endure, but I'll keep you alive. Just hold on a little longer." She moved her hands with deliberate care, reaching into the folds of her cloak to retrieve small vials and herbs. Edwin's vision blurred, his body too weak to comprehend what was happening, but he felt the warmth of something being pressed to his lips, bitter, herbal, yet soothing as it slid down his throat. The cold began to recede, replaced by a dull warmth spreading through his chest, numbing the pain that had gripped his body moments before. "Who are you?" he finally croaked, his voice weak but clear enough to be heard. The woman paused, her eyes studying him for a long moment before she spoke. "My name is Heir. I'm a healer of sorts, though my skills go beyond the usual remedies of plants and poultices." There was a hint of amusement in her tone, as if she found something quietly humorous about his question. "You've stumbled into dangerous waters, young prince, and I've come to guide you through them." Edwin's heart skipped a beat at the word prince. The same word Aldrich had used, the same absurd claim he had rejected in the heat of panic. But now, hearing it again in the calm, steady voice of this strange woman, it took on a weight that he couldn't ignore. "I'm no prince," he rasped, shaking his head weakly. "You're mistaken." Elara's eyes softened, though a faint smile touched her lips. "You may not feel like one now, but the blood in your veins says otherwise. It is no mistake, Edwin. You are the son of King Alden, rightful heir to a throne that has been stolen from you." Edwin felt a lump in his throat. How could this be true? His entire life had been spent in a small village, unknown, unnoticed. He was just a blacksmith's apprentice, abandoned as a baby with nothing but a name and a book that held no meaning to him. How could he, of all people, be the son of a king? He shook his head again, this time with more conviction. "There's been a mistake. I don't belong in this. I'm just a blacksmith's apprentice?" Elara finished for him, raising an eyebrow. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think Aldrich didn't know it when he found you? You've lived your life in the shadows, because it was the only way to protect you. You were hidden for a reason, Edwin." Her voice softened, taking on a tone of sympathy as she continued. "The man who sits on the throne now, Lord Meron, had your father murdered. He betrayed the kingdom to seize power, and for years, his tyranny has poisoned the land. But there are still those of us who remember the true king. We've waited for this moment for you." Edwin swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a heavy stone. "Why didn't Aldrich tell me all of this sooner?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elara sighed, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders as she gazed out at the river. "Aldrich had his reasons, some of which even I don't fully understand. He believed you weren't ready to know the truth, that the time had to be right. And perhaps he feared what might happen if you knew too much too soon." She stood then, rising gracefully from her kneeling position. "But that no longer matters. The time for secrecy is over. The mercenaries who chased you tonight will return, and there will be more of them. They won't stop until you're dead or captured. We need to leave before dawn. You're not safe here." Edwin struggled to sit up, his muscles protesting with every movement. His body still ached from the cold, but the potion Elara had given him had restored some of his strength. He managed to push himself to his feet, though he swayed unsteadily. Alara was at his side in an instant, her hand firm on his arm as she steadied him. "Why are you helping me?" Edwin asked, looking into her eyes. "You don't even know me." Alara's expression softened again, but this time there was a flicker of something deeper in her gaze, something like sorrow. "I knew your father," she said quietly. "He was a good man, a just king. And when Lord Meron betrayed him, many of us lost everything. I lost someone I loved dearly that day." Her voice trembled slightly before she steadied it. "I owe it to your father, to the kingdom, to see this through. You are the last hope for us all." Edwin's chest tightened. He had never felt the weight of responsibility like this before. It was terrifying, overwhelming, but it was also undeniable. He could feel the truth of her words settling deep within him, even as his mind fought against it. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Alara's expression grew serious once more. "We leave. There's a safe house not far from here, hidden deep within the forest. We'll rest there until you're strong enough to continue. And then we begin preparing for what's to come." Edwin nodded, though uncertainty still gnawed at him. Every step of this journey felt like plunging deeper into an unknown darkness, but he couldn't turn back now. Something greater than himself had been set in motion, and whether he liked it or not, he was at the center of it. With Alara's help, Edwin began walking, his legs still shaky, but his resolve strengthening with each step. The forest loomed ahead, dark and mysterious, but this time, he felt less afraid. Beside him, Alara moved with the quiet grace of someone who had lived in the shadows for far too long. They walked in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant murmur of the river behind them. As they disappeared into the trees, Edwin couldn't help but glance back, his eyes searching the horizon for any sign of the life he had left behind. But the village of Gleaner was far behind them now, lost to the night. There was no going back, not anymore. The forest closed in around them as Edwin and Alara moved deeper into its heart. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled trunks twisted by centuries of wind and weather. Their branches formed a thick canopy overhead, casting the world below into a perpetual twilight. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the gaps in the leaves. It was a different kind of darkness than the one Edwin had known in his village, a living, breathing shadow that seemed to watch their every move. Edwin's body still ached from his escape, but the warmth of Alara's potion had settled into his bones, easing the worst of his pain. Each step felt steadier than the last, though his mind was still reeling from everything that had happened. The quiet of the forest was a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before, but it did little to soothe the storm of questions swirling in his head. Alara walked beside him, silent and purposeful, her gaze sweeping the path ahead with the alertness of someone who knew danger could strike at any moment. She moved with an ease that betrayed her familiarity with the woods, her steps light and sure, as though she had traveled this way many times before. It was only when they came to a narrow, winding trail that branched off from the main path that she finally spoke. "We're close now," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The safe house is hidden just beyond this ridge. It's well concealed. Few know of its existence." Edwin glanced at her, his curiosity piqued. "Who built it?" Alara's lips curved into a faint smile. "Your father, King Alden, long before you were born. He had it constructed as a sanctuary for those loyal to the crown. In times of war, it was a place of refuge, a place where the resistance could regroup and plan without fear of being discovered." Edwin's steps faltered at the mention of his father, the man he had never known but whose shadow now loomed over his every thought. He had so many questions, so many things he needed to understand, but he didn't know where to begin. The words felt too heavy in his mouth, too strange to say aloud. Instead, he kept walking, following Alara's lead as they climbed the ridge. At the top, the path leveled out, and the trees thinned slightly, revealing a small clearing nestled between the hills. In the center of the clearing stood a modest stone cabin, its walls thick and weathered, covered in creeping ivy. The roof was low, with smoke curling faintly from a small chimney. It looked peaceful, almost forgotten by time, as if it had stood there undisturbed for centuries. Alara led the way to the cabin's door, her hand brushing lightly against the stone as she approached, as if greeting an old friend. "We'll be safe here for the time being," she said, pushing the door open with a creak. "Come inside. There's a fire already going." Edwin followed her into the cabin, his eyes adjusting to the dim light within. The interior was small but warm, with a hearth blazing in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the room. The furniture was simple, wooden chairs and a table, shelves lined with jars of herbs and dried meats. A thick rug covered the stone floor, and a narrow bed was tucked into the far corner. It was far more comfortable than any place Edwin had expected to find on the run. Alara moved toward the hearth, stirring the fire with a poker before setting a kettle over the flames. She worked in silence, her movements practiced and efficient. Edwin, still standing by the door, felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him again. He sank into one of the wooden chairs, his body aching for rest, but his mind still buzzing with questions. "Alara," he began slowly, his voice hesitant. "You said you knew my father. What was he like?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and Alara's hands stilled as she stood by the fire. She didn't turn to face him immediately, her gaze fixed on the flames as they crackled and danced before her. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, laced with the faintest hint of sorrow. "Your father was a man of great wisdom and kindness," she said. "He ruled with a sense of justice that inspired loyalty in those who served him. But he was also a man burdened by the weight of the crown. There were always those who sought to undermine him, those who desired the power he held. And in the end, it was that desire that led to his downfall." She paused, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. Lord Mehran was once his most trusted advisor. They had known each other since childhood, and my king believed in him, even when others warned him not to. But Mehran's ambition ran deeper than anyone realized. When the time was right, he struck, orchestrating your father's murder and seizing the throne for himself. Edwin listened in silence, the pit in his stomach growing deeper with every word. He had always wondered about his parents, about the life he might have had if things had been different. But hearing it now, the story of his father's betrayal and murder, it was almost too much to bear. His fists clenched in his lap, a wave of anger rising in his chest. "Why didn't anyone stop him?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why did they let him take everything?" Alara turned to face him then, her expression unreadable. "Many tried," she said softly. But Mehran had spent years consolidating power, building alliances in secret. By the time anyone realized the extent of his treachery, it was too late. The kingdom was already under his control, and those who opposed him were swiftly dealt with. She crossed the room, kneeling beside him and placing a hand on his arm. "But that's why you're here now, Edwin. You are the last hope to set things right. Mehran's reign has brought nothing but suffering and despair to the kingdom. But with you, with the rightful heir, there's a chance to restore what was lost." Edwin's jaw tightened, his thoughts swirling in a storm of confusion and doubt. "I'm just one person," he said, shaking his head. "How am I supposed to do all of this? How can I take on a man like Mehran?" Alara's grip on his arm tightened, her eyes locking with his. "You won't be alone," she said, her voice fierce with conviction. "There are still those who are loyal to the crown, those who remember what it was like under your father's rule. They will fight for you just as they fought for him. And I will be by your side every step of the way." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling Edwin back from the edge of despair. He didn't know if he believed her, if he could believe in himself enough to face the path ahead. But there was no turning back now. He had to try. For his father. For the kingdom. Alara stood then, her cloak swirling around her as she moved to the hearth. For now you need to rest. Tomorrow, we begin planning our next move. There are people we need to reach, alliances we must forge. The road ahead won't be easy, but it's one we must walk together. Edwin nodded, too tired to argue. He rose from the chair and crossed the room to the bed, sinking into the soft mattress with a weary sigh. His body ached, but his mind was too full of thoughts to allow him to sleep easily. As he lay there, staring up at the wooden beams of the cabin ceiling, he couldn't help but wonder what his father had been like. What it would have been like to grow up as a prince instead of a blacksmith's apprentice. But those thoughts brought no comfort. The truth was, the life he had known was gone. The life he had been destined for was waiting, and it was filled with danger, betrayal, and a battle he wasn't sure he could win. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the stone walls of the cabin, casting long, golden streaks across the floor. Edwin stirred in the bed, the weight of the previous night's revelations pressing down on him as he blinked into wakefulness. His body still ached from the cold of the river, but it was nothing compared to the exhaustion that clung to his mind. Alara was already awake, seated near the hearth, her fingers deftly weaving together various herbs. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with a comforting warmth that contrasted sharply with the tension that hung in the air between them. Edwin had slept little, his thoughts too crowded with questions and doubts, each one louder than the last. How was he supposed to take on the mantle of a prince when he had spent his life as nothing more than an apprentice? How could he possibly hope to stand against a man like Lord Meron? Alara looked up as Edwin rose from the bed, her gaze steady, though she said nothing. She seemed to sense the turmoil in his mind, and, for now, let it remain unspoken. Instead, she nodded toward a small bowl of porridge she had prepared, set on the table beside him. "Eat something? You'll need your strength," she said simply. Edwin sat down at the table, but the food held little appeal. His appetite had been dulled by the weight of everything he had learned, but he forced himself to take a few bites, knowing she was right. There was no telling what the day would bring, and he needed to be ready for whatever came next. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until Edwin couldn't bear it any longer. "You told me about my father," he began slowly, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "But what about my mother? Who was she?" Alara's hand stilled for a moment as she worked, her eyes flickering with a brief, unreadable emotion before she met his gaze. "Your mother was a woman of great strength, though her name has been all but erased from history since Meron took the throne. Her name was Lysandra, and she was not of noble blood." The revelation made Edwin pause. He had always imagined that if his father had been a king, his mother must have been a queen, someone of equal standing, someone who belonged in a world of power and influence. But the way Alara spoke, with a quiet respect laced with sadness, told him that Lysandra had been something else entirely. "She was a healer," Alara continued, her voice soft but firm, "much like myself. But she was more than that. She was a woman of the people, someone who cared deeply for the kingdom and its people, even though she held no title or land. Your father loved her not for her birthright, but for her heart. It was a union that was not meant to be, at least not in the eyes of those who valued power above all else." Edwin absorbed this in silence. His mother, a commoner, a healer. It made sense, in a way, why he had been hidden, why his existence had been kept secret. A king who married beneath his station, who fathered a child with a woman of no noble birth. Such a union would have been seen as a weakness, a vulnerability that Lord Meron could have exploited. It was no wonder his parents had gone to such lengths to protect him. "What happened to her?" Edwin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alara's face darkened, her eyes clouding with a sorrow that ran deep. "She died not long after your father was murdered. Some say it was from a broken heart. Others believe she was poisoned. But no one knows for certain. By the time anyone could reach her, it was too late." Edwin's chest tightened at the thought. He had been so young, too young to remember anything about her. His memories of his mother were like shadows, fleeting and distant, impossible to grasp. He had lived his whole life not knowing her, not knowing any of his true family. And now, the weight of their deaths, of the legacy they had left him, was almost too much to bear. Alara watched him closely, her expression softening. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said gently. "But you need to understand something, Edwin. Your mother and father sacrificed everything to protect you, to give you a chance at a future. They believed that one day you would return to reclaim what is rightfully yours." Edwin's hands clenched into fists on the table. He wanted to believe her, wanted to think that he could somehow honor their memory by taking up this impossible burden. But the doubt still gnawed at him, whispering in the back of his mind. He was just one person. How could he hope to stand against an enemy as powerful as Meron? "What if I fail?" he asked, his voice raw with the fear he had been trying to suppress. "What if I'm not strong enough to do this?" Alara rose from her seat by the hearth and crossed the room to stand before him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm but reassuring. "Failure is not an option," she said, her eyes fierce. "You carry the blood of kings in your veins, but more importantly, you carry the strength of your mother's people. You may not have been raised in a palace, but you were raised with the values that truly matter: honor, loyalty, and the will to fight for what is right." She stepped back, her gaze never leaving his. "This is not just about you, Edwin. This is about the kingdom. Meron's reign has brought nothing but suffering and despair to the people, and they need someone to stand up for them. You are that someone." Edwin looked up at her, the fire in her eyes sparking something deep within him. He didn't know if he believed in himself yet, but Alara's faith in him was unwavering. It was the kind of faith he had never experienced before, and it was enough to push him forward, even if just for another day. Before he could respond, a sudden noise outside the cabin shattered the moment. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. But then it grew louder. Footsteps, the unmistakable sound of steel clinking against steel. Alara's expression shifted in an instant, her body tensing as she moved toward the door. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice low and urgent. "If it's the mercenaries, we can't let them know you're here." Edwin's heart pounded in his chest as she slipped outside, her cloak billowing behind her. The moments that followed stretched out, each second heavier than the last. He strained to listen, every muscle in his body coiled tight with fear. Who had found them? How could they have tracked him here so quickly? He moved to the window, peering out into the clearing, just in time to see Alara standing at the edge of the trees, her back to him. She was speaking to someone, her voice too low for him to hear. But her posture was tense, her hand hovering near the hilt of a knife hidden beneath her cloak. Edwin couldn't see who she was talking to, but his gut twisted with a sense of foreboding. Something wasn't right. He knew it in his bones. Before he could make a move, Alara turned sharply and rushed back to the cabin, her face set in a mask of determination. She shut the door behind her, her breath coming fast. "We need to leave," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Now." Edwin's pulse quickened. "Who was it?" Alara shook her head, already gathering her things. "There's no time to explain. They know you're here. We can't stay any longer." A knot of fear twisted in Edwin's gut as he hurried to follow her lead, grabbing his cloak and the few belongings he had. The quiet refuge of the cabin had been shattered, replaced once more by the looming threat of pursuit. He didn't know how long they had before the enemy closed in, but one thing was certain: they were running out of time. The air outside was thick with tension as Edwin and Alara moved swiftly through the forest, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot barely audible over the pounding of Edwin's heart. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper now, more oppressive, as though the very forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. There was no moon tonight, and the darkness was near absolute, broken only by the faint glimmers of starlight that struggled through the dense canopy above. Edwin's mind raced as they ran, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Every step felt like a plunge into deeper uncertainty. His muscles still ached from the night before, and the exhaustion that had settled into his bones weighed heavier with each passing moment. But fear drove him forward. Whoever Alara had spoken to outside the cabin had found them, and if they didn't keep moving, they wouldn't live to see the dawn. Alara moved ahead of him, her footsteps sure and steady, despite the thickening darkness. She had said nothing more since their hasty departure, her focus entirely on the path ahead. But Edwin's mind couldn't quiet. He wanted answers, needed to know who was after them, why they had been found so quickly. But now was not the time to ask. Survival came first. Branches snagged at his clothes as they pushed through the underbrush, their path winding and twisting through the dense forest. The further they ran, the more disoriented Edwin felt. It was as if the trees themselves were conspiring to confuse him, every turn leading deeper into a maze of shadows. Alara seemed to know where she was going, but even her movements had taken on a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. Who were they? Edwin finally whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. Alara glanced back at him, her face grim. "Mercenaries," she said quietly. "The same ones who attacked you in the village. But there are more of them now." Edwin's stomach twisted. How did they find us so quickly? Alara's jaw tightened as she pushed aside a low-hanging branch. "We were betrayed. Someone gave them our location." The weight of her words settled over Edwin like a cold, heavy stone. He had suspected as much, but hearing it aloud made it real. Someone, perhaps even someone within the resistance, had betrayed them, given away their hiding place to Meron's forces. The thought sent a surge of anger through him, but also fear. If they had been betrayed once, who else could they trust? Was anyone truly on their side? They ran in silence for what felt like hours, the forest stretching endlessly before them. Edwin's legs burned with fatigue, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He had trained his body to withstand long hours at the forge, but this was different. This was a relentless, desperate race for survival, and he could feel his strength slipping away with every step. Just when he thought he could run no further, Alara slowed, holding up a hand to signal for him to stop. Edwin skidded to a halt, leaning heavily against a nearby tree as he struggled to catch his breath. His chest heaved, the air burning in his lungs, but he forced himself to remain silent, his senses straining for any sign of pursuit. Alara knelt beside him, her eyes scanning the surrounding forest. For a moment, the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, the faint hum of night insects. But then, from somewhere far behind them, Edwin heard it, a distant clatter of metal, the unmistakable sound of boots crunching through the underbrush. The mercenaries were still on their trail. "We don't have much time," Alara whispered, her voice tense. "We need to reach the river. They won't be able to track us through the water." Edwin nodded, though his body screamed in protest. His muscles felt like lead, his mind a fog of exhaustion. But the fear of being caught drove him forward. With a nod from Alara, they began moving again, this time more cautiously, sticking to the shadows and making as little noise as possible. The river wasn't far now. Edwin could hear the faint rush of water somewhere ahead, a steady, calming sound that promised a brief respite from the relentless chase. But just as they rounded a bend in the path, Alara suddenly stopped, holding up her hand again. Edwin froze beside her, his heart thudding in his chest. Ahead, through the thick trees, he could just make out the faint glimmer of torchlight. It flickered and danced in the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. Alara's hand tightened around the hilt of her knife as she crouched lower, pulling Edwin down beside her. "They're ahead of us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to find another way." Edwin's pulse quickened. They were surrounded, mercenaries behind them, and now ahead as well. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but nothing came. They couldn't go back, and if they pressed forward, they'd walk straight into the enemy's path. Alara's eyes scanned the trees, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There's another path," she murmured, more to herself than to Edwin. "It's dangerous, but it's our only option." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed his arm and pulled him to his feet, leading him off the main trail and into the dense underbrush. The ground sloped sharply downward, and Edwin struggled to keep his footing as they descended into a narrow ravine. The air was damp and cold here, the thick roots of ancient trees twisting through the earth like gnarled fingers. Every step was treacherous, the ground slick with moss and mud. They moved in silence, the weight of the forest pressing down on them from all sides. Edwin's senses were on high alert, every rustle of leaves, every distant sound sending a jolt of fear through his body. The further they went, the darker it became, until the faint glow of torchlight was nothing but a memory behind them. At last, they reached the bottom of the ravine, where the river wound its way through the forest like a silver thread. The water was fast-moving, its surface shimmering in the dim light, but it was their only hope. Alara knelt beside the riverbank, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. "We'll cross here," she said, her voice low. "The current is strong, but if we stay together we can make it." Edwin's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the rushing water. It wasn't just the strength of the current that unnerved him. It was the thought of what waited on the other side. More mercenaries, more betrayal, more uncertainty. But there was no other choice. Alara waded into the river first, the water swirling around her legs as she braced herself against the current. She reached out a hand to Edwin, her eyes steady. "Trust me," she said, her voice cutting through the roar of the water. With a deep breath, Edwin took her hand and stepped into the river. The cold water hit him like a shock, and the current pulled at him with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. But Alara's grip was strong, and together they pushed through the swirling water, their feet slipping over the smooth rocks beneath them. The river was deeper than Edwin had anticipated, and soon the water was up to his waist, the cold biting through his clothes. He clenched his teeth, forcing himself to stay focused, to keep moving. The other side was close now, just a few more steps. He could see the bank rising ahead, a small patch of safety in an ocean of danger. But then, just as they reached the center of the river, something shifted in the air. A faint whistle, barely perceptible over the rush of water. Alara's eyes widened, her grip tightening on Edwin's arm. "Down!" she shouted, pulling him under the water just as an arrow whizzed past, missing them by inches. The cold water closed over Edwin's head, and for a moment everything was silence. The world above dissolved into a blur of darkness and sound. He kicked hard, pushing against the current as Alara guided him toward the far bank. They broke the surface together, gasping for air as they scrambled onto the muddy shore, their bodies shaking with cold and adrenaline. Edwin collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving as he sucked in deep breaths. His mind was spinning, his body numb, but they had made it. Somehow, against all odds, they had made it across. Alara knelt beside him, her eyes scanning the trees behind them for any sign of pursuit. The mercenaries would follow, But for now, they had gained a precious few moments of respite. She reached out, placing a hand on Edwin's shoulder, her touch steady despite the chaos of the moment. "We're not out of danger yet," she said, her voice low. "But we're alive, and that's enough for now." Edwin nodded, too exhausted to respond. The night was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived this far. Maybe, just maybe, they could survive what was coming next. Edwin lay on the muddy riverbank, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. His body ached, the cold from the river still biting into his bones. But it was the exhaustion that weighed on him most heavily. His thoughts were muddled, a swirl of fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. The world around him seemed dim, distant, as though the forest itself was closing in, blotting out the last remnants of light. But they had made it across the river. They had survived. Alara crouched beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the treeline. She was alert, even now, her senses honed to every movement, every sound that echoed through the night. Edwin could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hand hovered near the hilt of her dagger. She had been calm throughout their flight, but there was no mistaking the urgency in her now. Something had shifted. "We can't stay here," Alara whispered, glancing down at him. "They'll follow us. The river will slow them, but it won't stop them." Edwin forced himself to sit up, his muscles protesting every movement. His limbs were heavy, his mind clouded with exhaustion. But he knew she was right. The mercenaries were relentless, and their pursuit would not end until they had him. There was no rest, not yet. He struggled to his feet, using the trunk of a nearby tree to steady himself. The forest loomed around them, dark and silent, save for the faint rustling of the leaves in the breeze. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, a reminder of the cold, unforgiving night that still lay ahead. "Where do we go?" Edwin asked, his voice hoarse from the cold and the strain of their flight. Alara's eyes flicked toward the deeper shadows of the forest. "There's a place not far from here, a village where the resistance has allies. We can rest there, regroup, and decide our next move." Edwin frowned. "A village? Won't they be waiting for us there? If we were betrayed once..." Alara shook her head, cutting him off. "This place is different. It's hidden, off the maps. Miron's men don't know it exists. And the people there, they've been fighting against his rule for years. They'll protect us." Her words held a certainty that Edwin couldn't argue with, though a flicker of doubt remained in his mind. They had already been betrayed once. Someone had given their location to the mercenaries, and the thought of walking into another potential trap set his nerves on edge. But they had no other choice. If they stayed here, they would be found. If they kept running without rest, they would collapse. This village, hidden in the shadows of Miron's kingdom, was their only hope. Without another word, Alara began to move, her steps silent as she led him deeper into the forest. The path ahead was narrow, barely visible in the dim light, but she navigated it with the ease of someone who had walked this way many times before. Edwin followed, his body screaming for rest, but he forced himself to keep going, one foot in front of the other. The forest seemed to close in around them, the branches overhead twisting together like dark fingers, blotting out the sky. As they walked, Edwin's thoughts drifted back to the betrayal. It gnawed at him, the idea that someone somewhere had sold them out. Who could it have been? He thought of Aldrich, the grizzled knight who had saved him from the mercenaries in the village. Aldrich had seemed loyal, determined to protect him. But even Edwin knew how easy it was for people to change their loyalties in desperate times. Gold, power, fear, any of these could turn even the most steadfast ally into an enemy. "Who do you think betrayed us?" Edwin asked quietly, breaking the silence. Alara's jaw tightened, but she didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained focused on the path ahead, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, measured. "There are many who would benefit from your capture, Edwin. Meron's influence reaches further than you can imagine. But I have my suspicions." "Who?" Edwin pressed, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Elara glanced back at him, her eyes sharp. "It could have been Aldrich." The words hit Edwin like a punch to the gut. He stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. Aldrich? The man who had risked his life to save him, who had fought beside him against the mercenaries. It didn't make sense. But the look in Elara's eyes told him she wasn't guessing blindly. She had reason to believe it. "I know it's hard to hear," she said softly, as though reading his thoughts. "But Aldrich is a man with a complicated past. He served your father, yes, but he also served Meron once. He changed sides when the winds of power shifted. Who's to say he won't change sides again?" Edwin felt a knot form in his chest. He had trusted Aldrich, believed in him. The idea that the knight could be the one who had betrayed them, it was almost too much to process. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Aldrich had been the one to bring him to the cabin. He had known their location, their plans. If anyone had the opportunity to betray them, it was him. Elara continued walking, her pace brisk, as though putting distance between them and the painful truth she had just revealed. Edwin followed, his mind churning with questions, doubts, and anger. If Aldrich had betrayed them, then who else could they trust? Was there anyone left who was truly loyal to his cause? The forest began to thin as they reached the outskirts of a small clearing. Elara slowed, her eyes scanning the trees around them before she stepped into the open. Ahead, hidden between the thick trunks of the trees, Edwin could just make out the faint outline of buildings. Wooden huts, their roofs thatched and low to the ground. The village was small, tucked away in the heart of the forest, almost invisible from a distance. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, and the soft glow of lanterns flickered in the windows. "We're here," Elara said, her voice low. "Stay close." Edwin followed her into the village, his senses on high alert. The village was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes from years of living in secrecy. The people here moved like shadows, their faces barely visible in the dim light. But Edwin could feel their eyes on him, watching, measuring. Elara led him to a small hut at the edge of the village, pushing open the door with a soft creak. Inside, the room was warm, a fire crackling in the hearth. The air smelled of herbs and wood smoke, and for the first time in what felt like days, Edwin felt a sense of safety. Elara motioned for him to sit by the fire as she crossed the room to speak quietly with a figure standing in the shadows, a tall man, his face obscured by the hood of his cloak. Their conversation was too low for Edwin to hear, but he could feel the tension in the room, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Elara turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "This is Sir Reginald," she said, gesturing to the man beside her. "He's one of the last knights loyal to your father." Edwin looked up at the man, feeling a mix of relief and wariness. Sir Reginald stepped forward, lowering his hood to reveal a weathered face marked by years of battle. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, but there was something guarded in his expression, as though he was holding back judgment. "We've been waiting for you," Reginald said, his voice deep and steady. "Your father's allies have not forgotten their oath. But this is just the beginning, Edwin. The path ahead will be treacherous. You'll need more than a crown to claim your throne." Edwin met the knight's gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of his father's legacy, the kingdom's hope, and the betrayal still fresh in his mind pressed down on him all at once. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what was to come, but one thing was certain: there was no turning back. The fire crackled softly, its warmth filling the small room as Edwin sat before it, his thoughts churning. Elara had retreated to the far corner of the hut, speaking quietly with Sir Reginald, their voices too low for him to hear. The quiet hum of their conversation was a distant backdrop to the storm of uncertainty brewing inside him. He was surrounded by people who claimed to be loyal to his father, allies in a fight he hadn't asked for. But with every passing moment, the weight of his role grew heavier. The knowledge that Aldrich might have betrayed him was a wound that hadn't yet healed. Edwin couldn't shake the image of the knight's scarred face, the memory of his fierce protection. If Aldrich had truly turned against him, then what hope did he have of trusting anyone? These thoughts festered in his mind as he stared into the flames, watching them dance and twist like the confusion that gripped his heart. Alara approached, breaking the silence with a gentle touch on his shoulder. She sat beside him, her presence as steady as it had been since the beginning of this journey, though her eyes held a weariness that spoke of years of burden. "You're quiet," she said, her voice soft but probing. "What's troubling you?" Edwin ran a hand through his damp hair, still chilled from the river crossing. He wanted to tell her everything about his doubts, his fears, the crushing sense of inadequacy that clung to him like a shadow. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he shook his head. "Everything. I don't even know where to begin." Alara's gaze softened, and for a moment, her hardened exterior seemed to fade, replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. "I understand," she said quietly. "You've been thrown into a war you weren't prepared for. The weight of the crown is heavy, and it can feel like a burden too great to bear. But you don't have to carry it alone." Edwin looked up at her, searching her face for some sign that she understood the depth of his struggle. "How can I lead these people?" he asked, his voice raw. "I've spent my whole life as a blacksmith's apprentice. I don't know how to be a king. I don't know how to fight this war." Alara's eyes never wavered from his. "Leadership isn't about knowing everything," she said. "It's about surrounding yourself with the right people. It's about making decisions that are in the best interest of your people, even when they're difficult. You were born with the blood of kings, yes, but more importantly, you were raised with the heart of a man who knows what it is to work, to struggle, to live among the people you will one day lead. That will make you a better king than any noble born into luxury." Her words struck a chord within him, but the doubts remained, lingering in the back of his mind like a persistent shadow. "And what if I fail?" he whispered. "What if I'm not strong enough?" Alara's hand tightened slightly on his shoulder, her voice firm. "Then we will all fail. But I believe in you, Edwin. Your father believed in you. And now it's time for you to believe in yourself." The weight of her words settled over him, but before he could respond, Sir Reginald stepped forward, his expression serious. "We need to talk," he said, his voice as rough and weathered as the lines on his face. "There are decisions to be made." Edwin stood, bracing himself for the conversation that would follow. He wasn't ready to lead an army, wasn't ready to be the symbol of hope that everyone seemed to expect. But the time for doubt was quickly running out. He followed Sir Reginald to the far end of the room, where a table was strewn with maps and documents, evidence of a war that had been fought in secret for years. Reginald pointed to the map spread before them, his finger tracing the lines of a sprawling kingdom that had once been ruled by Edwin's father. "Meron's hold on the capital is strong," he began, his voice steady. "But there are pockets of resistance scattered throughout the land. Some are loyal to the old crown, while others are simply tired of living under his tyranny. If we can rally these forces, we have a chance of retaking the throne." Edwin studied the map, his eyes following the routes and battle lines drawn across it. The kingdom seemed vast, and the challenges they faced even greater. "How many men do we have?" he asked, his voice betraying his lack of confidence. Reginald's jaw tightened. "Not enough," he admitted. "But that's where you come in. You are the rightful heir to the throne. Your return will inspire those who have been waiting for a sign." If you show yourself, if you lead them, they will fight for you? Edwin felt the weight of Reginald's words settle on his shoulders. The plan was simple in theory, but the reality of it was far more daunting. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a leader. He was just a young man who had been thrust into a war he didn't understand. But looking at the faces of those around him, Alara, Reginald, and the others who had silently gathered in the shadows of the hut, he realized that they were all counting on him. And for the first time, the full scope of what lay ahead hit him with crushing clarity. "I don't know if I can do this," Edwin said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the map. Reginald placed a hand on his shoulder, the weight of his touch firm but reassuring. "No one ever knows, lad," he said. "Not until they're tested. But you have the blood of a king in your veins. And more importantly, you have the will of the people behind you. That's more than enough to start." Edwin nodded, though the doubts still lingered. He wanted to believe in himself, wanted to be the leader they needed him to be. But the fear of failure was ever present. Still, there was no turning back now. He had made it this far. He couldn't abandon the people who were counting on him. Alara stepped forward, her expression serious. "We'll need to move soon," she said. "Meron's spies are everywhere. If word of Edwin's return reaches them before we're ready, we'll be fighting a losing battle before it even begins." Reginald nodded in agreement. "We have a small window of time before Meron realizes what's happening. We'll need to move quickly, gather our allies, and strike before he can solidify his defenses." Edwin felt his heart quicken at the thought of what was to come. The idea of leading an army, of standing against Meron and his forces, seemed impossible. But he had no choice. The time for hesitation was over. "What do we do first?" Edwin asked, his voice steady, though his hands trembled slightly at his sides. Reginald leaned over the map, his finger tracing a path toward the southern regions of the kingdom. "There's a stronghold here in the mountains. It's been held by a group of rebels loyal to your father's memory. If we can reach them, we'll have a place to gather our forces, a base from which we can strike out against Meron's armies." Alara nodded, her eyes sharp with determination. "It won't be easy," she said. "The journey through the mountains is treacherous, and Meron's patrols are thick in the area. But if we can make it, we'll be one step closer to taking back the kingdom." Edwin looked at the map, at the path they would have to take, and felt a chill run down his spine. The road ahead was fraught with danger, and there was no guarantee they would succeed. But the fire in Alara's eyes, the quiet resolve in Reginald's voice, gave him the strength to push forward. "We leave at first light," Edwin said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "We'll gather our allies, and we'll take back what's ours." For the first time since this journey began, Edwin felt a flicker of something deep inside him, something that had been buried beneath the doubt and fear. It wasn't confidence, not yet, but it was the beginning of resolve. He wasn't ready to be a king, but he was ready to fight for the people who believed in him. And for now that was enough. The first light of dawn barely touched the treetops as Edwin, Alara, and Sir Reginald began their journey toward the southern mountains. The forest that had once felt like a labyrinth of shadows now seemed eerily calm in the early morning light. But the silence was thick with tension. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves in the wind, set Edwin on edge. His senses were on high alert, the danger of the mercenaries still fresh in his mind. But as they pressed on, the stillness of the forest began to give way to the imposing presence of the mountains that loomed ahead, jagged and unforgiving against the pale sky. The path grew steeper as they ascended, the air growing colder and thinner with each step. The trees that had once provided cover and protection were thinning, replaced by rough stone and craggy outcroppings. Edwin's legs burned with the strain of the climb, his breath coming in sharp bursts. But he forced himself to keep up with Alara and Reginald, who moved with the confidence of people who had taken this route many times before. Alara, ever vigilant, led the way with the grace and precision of a scout, her eyes constantly scanning the path ahead for signs of danger. Behind her, Sir Reginald moved like a warrior accustomed to hardship, his broad shoulders and imposing frame steady despite the grueling climb. Edwin found himself somewhere in between them, feeling the weight of his inexperience with each step. But he was determined to prove himself, not just to them, but to himself as well. As they climbed higher, the landscape became more treacherous. The narrow path wound its way along the mountainside, with steep drops on either side that made Edwin's stomach churn. The wind howled through the rocky cliffs, carrying with it a biting chill that cut through his cloak and left him shivering. His boots slipped on the loose gravel more than once, and each time, his heart leapt into his throat as he fought to keep his balance. Alara paused up ahead, turning to glance back at him. "Careful," she called over the wind, her voice steady but laced with warning. "This path is known for its traps. Mercenaries' men sometimes lay them for those who pass through here." Edwin swallowed hard, nodding as he moved carefully behind her. His hand hovered near the hilt of his dagger, though he doubted it would be much use against whatever dangers lurked in the mountains. Still, the thought of Mercenaries' soldiers lying in wait sent a fresh wave of anxiety through him. Sir Reginald, sensing Edwin's unease, fell back to walk beside him. "These mountains have always been dangerous," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "But they also offer protection. The terrain is harsh, and not many are willing to risk the climb. That's why the rebels chose this place for their stronghold." Edwin glanced up at the towering peaks ahead, their jagged edges cutting into the sky like the teeth of some ancient, slumbering beast. "Do you think they'll help us?" he asked quietly. "The rebels, I mean. Will they even believe who I am?" Reginald was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "They'll believe," he said finally. "But belief doesn't mean trust. You'll have to prove yourself to them, just as you have to prove yourself to us." Edwin's heart sank at the thought. He had spent his entire life proving himself, to Master Heir at the forge, to the villagers who had seen him as nothing more than an orphan, to the people who had expected nothing from him. And now, as the supposed heir to a throne he had never known, he would have to prove himself all over again. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, heavy as the mountain itself. The hours passed in a blur of relentless climbing, the path growing steeper and more perilous with each step. Edwin's muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed through the pain, driven by a sense of purpose he had never known before. Every step brought him closer to something, whether it was victory or defeat. He couldn't yet say, but he knew that he couldn't turn back. Not now. By midday, they had reached a narrow plateau nestled between two towering cliffs. The wind had picked up, whipping through the mountains with a force that made it hard to keep their footing. Edwin's face was numb from the cold, his fingers stiff despite the gloves he wore. But as they reached the edge of the plateau, Alara raised a hand, signaling for them to stop. "We're close," she said, her breath visible in the frigid air. "The stronghold is just beyond this ridge, but we'll need to be careful. They won't welcome strangers lightly, even if we come in peace." Edwin nodded, his stomach twisting with a mix of anticipation and nerves. He had no idea what to expect from the rebels. These people who had been fighting in the shadows for years, resisting Mercenaries' rule with every breath. Would they see him as a savior or as an impostor? Would they rally behind him or cast him out as a pretender? As they moved cautiously toward the ridge, Edwin's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, quick, deliberate, and too close for comfort. His heart leapt into his throat as he turned, his hand flying to the hilt of his dagger. Alara and Reginald were already on high alert, their eyes scanning the rocky landscape for the source of the sound. From the shadows of the cliffs, figures emerged, silent, hooded figures, their movements swift and precise. There were at least half a dozen of them, armed with bows and swords, their faces obscured by dark cloaks. They moved with the confidence of people who knew these mountains well, their steps barely making a sound as they surrounded the trio. Reginald's hand went to the hilt of his sword, but he made no move to draw it. Alara, too, remained still, though her eyes were sharp, watching every movement of the approaching figures. Edwin's pulse raced, his grip tightening on his dagger, though he knew it would do little against the trained warriors who now encircled them. One of the figures stepped forward, lowering his hood to reveal a weathered face, scarred and hardened by years of battle. His eyes were sharp, cold, as they flicked between Alara, Reginald, and finally, Edwin. There was no recognition in his gaze, only suspicion. "What business do you have here?" the man demanded, his voice low and rough. "These mountains are not kind to trespassers." Alara stepped forward, her posture calm but authoritative. "We come in peace," she said, her voice steady. "We seek an audience with the leaders of the resistance." The man's eyes narrowed. "And who are you to demand such a thing?" Alara glanced at Edwin, then back at the man. "We bring news of the true heir to the throne. This boy is King Alden's son, and he has come to reclaim his birthright." The silence that followed was deafening. The man's eyes flicked to Edwin, scrutinizing him with a gaze so intense it made his skin crawl. The other figures shifted slightly, their weapons still at the ready, their expressions unreadable. For a long moment no one moved. Then, slowly, the man stepped closer to Edwin, his eyes narrowing as he studied him. "Alden's son, you say?" he muttered, his tone filled with doubt. "We've heard that story before. Many have claimed the crown. None have lived to wear it." Edwin swallowed hard, the weight of the man's gaze pressing down on him like a physical force. He felt exposed, vulnerable, standing before these warriors who had fought and bled for a cause they believed in. He was nothing compared to them, just a boy, an apprentice who had been swept up in a fight he didn't understand. But something inside him stirred, a flicker of the resolve he had felt the night before. He had come this far. He couldn't turn back now. "I am Edwin," he said, his voice firmer than he expected. "Son of King Alden. I don't expect you to believe me just because I say so, but I have come to fight for this kingdom, to fight for what my father stood for. And I will prove myself if you give me the chance." The man's eyes lingered on Edwin for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he turned to the others. "Take them to the stronghold. We'll see if this boy speaks the truth." The rebels led Edwin, Alara, and Sir Reginald through a narrow, hidden trail that twisted deeper into the mountains. The wind was fiercer here, howling through the cliffs like the voices of the lost. The path wound through jagged rock formations, the terrain uneven and treacherous, but the rebel warriors moved as if they were part of the landscape itself, every step sure and silent. Edwin, still uneasy from the encounter, followed with a growing sense of foreboding. He had expected resistance, but the cold, mistrustful looks from the rebels only deepened the knot of doubt in his chest. The stronghold revealed itself slowly, carved into the mountainside as though it had grown from the very rock. At first glance, it appeared nothing more than a collection of boulders and crags, but as they approached, the details emerged, low stone buildings blending seamlessly with the cliffs, reinforced with wood and iron. Torches flickered in the sharp wind, casting dancing shadows against the stone walls. It was a fortress, concealed from the outside world, and a perfect place for those who lived on the edge of rebellion. The rebels guided them toward the central structure, where two massive wooden doors stood flanked by sentries. Their faces were as hard and unyielding as the mountains themselves. One of the warriors knocked twice on the iron-studded doors, the sound echoing through the valley like a warning bell. The doors creaked open, and Edwin found himself being ushered into a large hall. The warmth of a fire greeted them immediately, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The hall was long and narrow, with rows of tables and benches lining the stone walls. At the far end of the room sat a figure that, even from a distance, commanded attention. He was a tall man, his hair streaked with gray, though his posture was that of someone much younger. His eyes, sharp and piercing, were fixed on Edwin the moment he stepped inside. "Rydian," the lead rebel called as they approached the man. "These are the ones we found at the pass. They claim the boy is the son of Alden." The figure, Rydian, rose slowly from his seat, his gaze never leaving Edwin. His presence filled the hall, his authority palpable even before he spoke. The room fell into an expectant silence as he stepped forward, his boots echoing against the stone floor. The firelight flickered across his face, casting deep shadows in the lines of his features. He had the look of a man who had seen countless battles, each one leaving its mark on his body and soul. "King Alden's son," Rydian said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent fighting in the shadows. "We have heard such claims before. None have proven true." Edwin's throat tightened. Every eye in the room was on him now, waiting, judging. The weight of expectation pressed down on him like a physical force. He could feel Alara's steady presence behind him, but it did little to ease the knot of tension in his chest. "I am Edwin," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "and I am the son of King Alden. I was hidden for my protection when Meron seized the throne. I know you have no reason to trust me, but I've come to fight for the kingdom my father built. I will prove myself if you give me the chance." Rydian studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched painfully, every second feeling like an eternity. Then, without a word, Rydian turned and nodded to one of the warriors standing by the door. The man stepped forward, carrying a large, weathered sword. Its blade was chipped and scarred from countless battles, but its hilt bore the unmistakable crest of the royal family, a roaring lion crowned with laurels. "This sword belonged to your father," Rydian said, holding the weapon out for Edwin to see. "Only those of his blood can wield it. If you truly are his son, this blade will recognize you." Edwin stared at the sword, his heart racing. The crest was the same as the one etched into the book Heir had kept for him, the only link to his past he had ever known. But this was different. This was real, tangible proof of the legacy he was supposed to carry. His hand hovered over the hilt, hesitating for just a moment. What if the sword rejected him? What if everything he believed about his birth was a lie? Taking a deep breath, Edwin wrapped his fingers around the hilt. The metal was cold against his skin, but it felt familiar, as though it had been waiting for him all along. Slowly, he lifted the sword. The weight of it settled into his hand, heavy but not unbearable. And then something extraordinary happened. The blade glowed faintly, a soft, golden light radiating from the metal, warming the air around him. The hall erupted in gasps and murmurs. Rydian's eyes narrowed, though there was a flicker of something like respect in his gaze. Edwin stood tall, holding the sword with a newfound sense of purpose. Whatever doubts had plagued him before began to fade, replaced by the quiet certainty that this was what he was meant to do. "It seems the sword recognizes you after all," Rydian said, his tone neutral but edged with something deeper, perhaps approval or perhaps relief. "But wielding your father's blade is not enough to win the loyalty of the resistance. You must prove yourself in battle," as he did. Edwin swallowed hard, the sword suddenly feeling much heavier in his hand. He had trained with weapons before, but the thought of fighting in a real battle, of leading others into danger, sent a chill through him. He wasn't ready. How could he be? Before he could respond, another voice cut through the murmurs. A woman's voice, clear and strong. "Rydian is right," she said, stepping forward from the shadows. She was tall, with dark hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to see straight through him. Her armor, though worn and dented, was clearly well maintained, and she carried herself with the confidence of a seasoned fighter. "This boy may have the blood of kings," she continued, her gaze never leaving Edwin's. "But blood alone does not make a leader. If he is to fight alongside us, he must earn that right." Edwin met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know who this woman was, but it was clear she held significant influence among the rebels. The way the others in the room looked at her, the respect in their eyes, it was undeniable. "What do you suggest?" Rydian asked, his voice calm but curious. The woman smiled, though it was more a challenge than a gesture of warmth. "A test," she said simply. "Let him face one of our best. If he survives, then we will consider his claim." Edwin's stomach dropped. A test. A fight. It was exactly what he had feared. He glanced at Alara, who met his gaze with a steady, unreadable expression. She wasn't going to intervene. This was something he had to face alone. "Very well," Rydian said after a long pause. "A test it shall be. Edwin, son of Alden, you will face one of our champions at dawn. If you prove yourself worthy, we will follow you into battle." Edwin nodded, though his throat felt tight and his palms slick with sweat. There was no way out of this. The rebels would not follow him unless he proved his worth, and the only way to do that was to fight. He would have to survive the night, gather his strength, and face the challenge that awaited him at dawn. As the rebels began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, Rydian stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "You've taken the first step, lad," he said, his eyes locking with Edwin's. "But don't mistake this for an easy path. You will be tested over and over again. It's not enough to carry the sword. You must carry the burden that comes with it." Edwin nodded, though the weight of Rydian's words settled heavily on his shoulders. He had claimed the sword, but now he had to prove himself worthy of it. And as dawn approached, bringing with it the promise of battle, Edwin couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The first rays of dawn cast a pale light over the mountain's stronghold, a soft glow that did little to warm the chill in the air. Edwin stood in the center of the training grounds, surrounded by the rebel warriors who had gathered to witness his test. The anticipation was palpable, a quiet hum of tension that buzzed through the air like a distant storm. His breath came in shallow bursts, visible in the cold morning air as he tightened his grip on the hilt of his father's sword. The weight of the blade felt different now, heavier but also more familiar, as if it had accepted him, recognized him as its rightful wielder. Across from him stood his opponent, a hulking figure clad in armor worn from years of battle. His name was Igor, one of the most feared fighters among the rebels, a man whose reputation had been built on countless victories in both open war and the shadows of rebellion. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Edwin with the steady gaze of a predator eyeing its prey. Igor's sword was massive, its edge glinting ominously in the early light. He made no move to speak, no gesture of acknowledgement. His presence alone was enough to fill the air with menace. Alara stood just behind Edwin, her face unreadable, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. She knew this test was as much about Edwin's survival as it was about gaining the loyalty of the rebels. If he failed here, there would be no second chances. The path to reclaiming the throne would be closed, the hopes of the kingdom dashed. But Edwin could feel her silent support, the strength she had given him throughout their journey, grounding him even now. Rydian stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "This is a test of skill and honor," he announced, his tone firm. "The boy claims to be King Alden's son, but words are not enough. Today, he will prove his worth in combat. The rules are simple. The fight will continue until one man is unable to rise. The crowd fell silent, their eyes shifting between Edwin and Igor. The weight of expectation pressed down on Edwin's shoulders, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had trained with a sword before, but never under these conditions, never with so much at stake. His heart pounded in his chest, but he pushed the fear aside. He had to focus. This was no longer about doubt or hesitation. It was about survival. Igor took a step forward, his massive sword raised in one hand as though it weighed nothing. His lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. "Let's see if you've inherited anything from your father other than his name," he growled. Edwin said nothing. He shifted his stance, his muscles tensing as he prepared for the first strike. Igor wasted no time. With a roar, he charged, his sword slicing through the air with terrifying speed and power. Edwin barely managed to dodge the blow, feeling the rush of wind as the blade passed inches from his head. The crowd gasped, but Edwin didn't stop to think. He moved on instinct, pivoting to the side and bringing his own sword up to parry the next strike. The clash of steel rang out across the training grounds, the sound sharp and deafening. Edwin's arms shook under the force of the impact, his muscles straining to hold his ground. Igor was stronger, faster, every swing of his sword carrying the weight of years of battle. But Edwin was lighter on his feet, quicker to evade the heavier strikes. He ducked under another sweeping blow, his heart racing as he swung his sword in a counterattack, aiming for Igor's side. The blade connected with a clang, but Igor barely flinched. His armor absorbed the strike, and with a growl, he spun around, knocking Edwin off balance with a powerful kick to the chest. Edwin stumbled back, gasping for breath as he struggled to stay on his feet. Pain shot through his ribs, but he couldn't afford to focus on it. Igor was coming for him again, his sword raised high. Edwin raised his blade just in time to block the next strike, but the force of the blow sent him crashing to the ground. His back hit the dirt hard. The wind knocked from his lungs. The world spun around him, the cold earth pressing against his body as he struggled to catch his breath. Igor loomed over him, his eyes filled with cold amusement. "Is this the best you can do, boy?" Igor taunted, raising his sword for the final blow. But something inside Edwin snapped. A memory surged through him, of his father, of the stories he had heard about the king who had fought not with brute strength, but with cunning and heart. Edwin's grip tightened on the hilt of his sword. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the kingdom, for the people who had suffered under Miron's rule, for the legacy his father had left behind. As Igor's sword came down, Edwin rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. Dirt flew up around him as the blade buried itself in the ground where he had been lying. Edwin pushed himself to his feet in one fluid motion, his heart pounding with renewed determination. He lunged forward, his sword cutting through the air with surprising speed. Igor turned just in time to block, but this time, Edwin was ready. He didn't go for a heavy strike. Instead, he focused on precision, using the speed and agility that came from years of hard work at the forge. He dodged Igor's wild swings, stepping inside the man's reach and slashing at the unprotected joints in his armor. One strike after another, small but effective. Igor grunted in frustration as Edwin's blade found its mark, cutting through the gaps in his defenses. The tide of the battle shifted. The crowd, which had been murmuring in doubt, began to stir with anticipation. Edwin could feel the change in the air, the momentum building as he pressed the attack. Igor's swings became slower, his movements more labored. His strength was waning, and Edwin knew he had to end it soon. With a final burst of energy, Edwin ducked under Igor's next strike and drove his sword upward, striking the hilt against the man's armored chest. Igor staggered back, his balance faltering. Edwin didn't hesitate. He spun on his heel, delivering a swift kick to Igor's knee. The larger man's leg buckled, and with a roar of frustration, he collapsed to the ground. For a moment, there was only silence. Igor lay on the dirt, breathing heavily, his sword lying just out of reach. He struggled to rise, but his body betrayed him. He couldn't get back up. Edwin stood over him, his chest heaving with exhaustion, the sword still gripped tightly in his hand. His vision swam, his limbs shaking from the strain of the fight. But he had done it. He had survived. The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound filling the training grounds with a wave of excitement and relief. Alara stepped forward, a small, proud smile on her face. Sir Reginald nodded, his expression grim but approving. Rydian, standing at the edge of the ring, crossed his arms, his eyes sharp and calculating as he studied Edwin. But there was a flicker of something else in his gaze now, respect. Igor, still on the ground, let out a low, bitter laugh. "Well, boy," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Looks like you've earned your name after all." Edwin didn't respond. He was too tired, too overwhelmed to speak. But as he looked out at the faces of the rebels, the warriors who had once doubted him, he saw something he hadn't expected. Hope. They believed in him now, believed in his claim. He had proven himself, not just with his bloodline, but with his actions. Rydian stepped forward, raising his hand to quiet the crowd. "Edwin, son of Alden," he called, his voice carrying over the cheers. "You have proven yourself in combat, as your father once did. You are worthy of the sword you carry, and of the crown you seek. From this day forward, we will follow you in the fight to reclaim this kingdom." The rebels bowed their heads in unison, a gesture of loyalty that sent a shiver down Edwin's spine. For the first time, he truly felt the weight of his father's legacy, and the responsibility that came with it. But he was ready.